The chair of this session is Ambassador Fabrice Filliez. He is the Swiss ambassador to Singapore. Prior to his appointment as ambassador to Singapore and Brunei, he served in Bern, Switzerland for 5 years at the Swiss State Secretariat for International Financial Matters. He has also held various positions at the Swiss Embassy in London, Swiss Mission to the EU, and the Directorate for Public International Law in Bern, Switzerland. Ambassador, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My name is Fabrice Filliez, and I'm Swiss ambassador in Singapore and in Brunei. It is my great pleasure today to chair the panel on the COVID-19 pandemic and international law. Nearly 1.5 years after the start of the pandemic, there are legitimate questions on the relation with international law and the impact of the pandemic on international and diplomatic law, and how COVID-19 and national protective measures are still today straining rules and norms of international law. I'm looking forward to the insights to the topic from my honorable colleagues, Professor Gabrielle Marceau from the University of Geneva and Senior Counselor at the WTO, Dr. Ayelet Berman, who leads global health and governance at NUS, and Deputy Attorney General Lionel Yee. Lionel will look at the impact of using virtual meeting technology for international lawmaking. Ayelet will address what has worked well under the international health regulation and what is missing. And if time allows, she will flag current reform initiatives. Gabrielle will cover the issue of trade and pandemic, specifically the question as why is international trade law, WTO law, so relevant today in the light of the pandemic. Before I give the word to my distinguished colleagues, let me quickly introduce my own thoughts on the topic from a diplomatic perspective. Coordination, cooperation, and solidarity are key in the face of the pandemic. Without concerted action, we simply won't be able to be back to a sustainable normal. Switzerland and Singapore are, for instance, important drivers for the COVAX initiative by co-chairing the group of friends of the COVAX facility. As you know, the COVAX was launched in April last year by the WHO, the European Commission, and France in response to the pandemic. COVAX is a truly global solution to the pandemic because it is the only effort to ensure that people in all corners of the world will get access to COVID-19 vaccines, regardless of their wealth. To enable and to bring to success such crucial initiatives, we obviously need diplomatic and sectorial cooperation across the borders. It is therefore important that all states make sure that the diplomatic missions in the country can remain fully functional in accordance with the Vienna Convention on the Diplomatic Relations in order to enable smooth cooperation and coordination to battle this crisis together. With this, I hand over to you, Lionel. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Excellency. Good afternoon, everyone. And also thanks, I think, to all the organizers for putting together what's, I think, quite a complex task of actually putting together this conference. When I was asked to speak on the pandemic and international law, what did occur to me was that there would be a lot of focus, I think, on the impact of the pandemic on international law norms. And I decided to look at it from a slightly different angle to see what its impact was on international legal processes. And those can range from international lawmaking all the way through to the conclusion of treaties to the adjudication of disputes over their interpretation. But I've been given fairly limited time, so what I intend to do is focus on international lawmaking, negotiations over treaties, over other international normative instruments. And here I think there is no doubt that the pandemic has upended the usual processes of international lawmaking. Those would typically involve your crowded conference rooms, breakouts, corridor deals, site meetings, and so on. And what is obviously, I think, very prevalent over the past year or so has been the adoption of online meeting technology. And that seems to have been most readily adopted for bilateral negotiations. And as the number of parties increases, it becomes a little less readily adopted at the multilateral level. And it's understandable because it's a reflection, I think, of the level of complexity, both in terms of logistics as well as negotiation dynamics as the number of parties increases. And it's also, I think, dependent on the extent to which informal discussions are likely to be required. And clearly, if you're talking about just two parties speaking to each other on say, Zoom, the need for informal discussions is probably less but not completely eliminated, because you may have situations where the heads of delegation of both sides may want, for example, to engage in a four eyes discussion. And Singapore has been involved, obviously, in a whole range of treaty negotiations, and they range from bilateral negotiations through to regional ones, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which was legally scrubbed and then eventually signed last year, and then to other negotiations at places like ASEAN, Commonwealth, and so on. With respect to the multilateral institutions like the United Nations, I think there has been caution by some member states about substantive negotiations taking place online. And at the phase where all these negotiations and meetings were taking place fully online, I think the tendency has been the discussions have been focused on largely procedural type decisions. But I think in more recent months, what we have seen is an evolution to the use of a hybrid meeting format, where you have some delegates participating in person and others participating virtually. And that has enabled, I think, more substantive discussions to take place. And this has happened at places like UNCITRAL and its working group, at the International Law Commission's postponed 72nd session, which I think they're right in the middle of at the moment. And I understand also at places like the World Trade Organization. I think one does need to be conscious of some of the challenges that may be faced in these virtual negotiations. First, I think, and most obvious of all, is that it's inherent in the nature of negotiations that it's important to build relationships. It's important to have sort of informal channels of communication, sort of chance pull asides, the need to read the body language of others, a reading of the room, and so on. And these are not quite so easily replicable in a virtual format. Even if you have something like the equivalent of a breakout room feature, I think there are still concerns about the level of, I think, comfort that what someone says in, say, a Zoom breakout room or even a private chat is really off the record. And that's quite different from, simply verbally conveying in person, say, a proposal to work out some quid pro quo on a particular issue. Then there are the logistical challenges, and they range from things like unreliable internet connectivity to things like mixed reviews I get on the use of a software called Interprify by the United Nations, by the WTO. I hear stories of the dropping of translation feeds that interrupt delegations trying to follow an intervention. And I understand that. I mean, Interprify is needed because of the need to provide for simultaneous interpretation. But nonetheless, I mean, where you deploy complicated software, then I think the likelihood of some technical issues arising will increase. Then there are challenges like access to equipment. In many of these sort of meetings, you're not just dealing with having to look at your fellow participants, but also to look at documents that are shared on screen, to look also at maybe chats that are going on where delegations are expressing their views. And that, I think, is very different if you're working in an environment where you have multiple screens, multiple monitors, as opposed to a small screen on a laptop. Then there are the challenges in terms of the convenience of time zones for certain delegations. And then finally, there will be the localized challenges, the impact, for example, of lockdowns, movement restrictions, on the extent to which a national delegation, especially one that consists of representatives from different parts of the government, can coordinate if, for example, they're not even allowed to be in the same room at the same time. And I think we need to be particularly conscious that many of these challenges I have flagged can play out in terms of equity type issues. Because I think the principle of maintaining a level playing field for the participation of all delegations in negotiations is an important principle. And one of the concerns is that many of the divides that come about from some of the challenges I have flagged, from infrastructural to equipment and so on, will often be on developing and developed world lines. And these challenges can be exacerbated with the increase in the use of hybrid meetings between those who have to participate virtually against those who are in-person attendees, the latter of which are more likely to come from those jurisdictions where the vaccination rates are higher and therefore travel is less restricted. And so I think it's important that those who, for example, chair these sessions need to be conscious of this. They need, for example, to slow down for virtual participants. This is to cater for things like the lags in transmission time and the simple reality that reaction time is a little bit slower online. It's one thing to be in a physical meeting room and raise your country name tag to ask for the floor, and quite something else to be raising your virtual hand in a virtual meeting, or asking for the floor through typing in a chat, let alone providing substantive comments on it. Beyond the pandemic, I don't think online meetings will really replace in-person negotiations, simply because of the importance of the interpersonal dynamics to these negotiations. But nonetheless, I believe that there is scope for some efficiencies to be gained from the use of such technology. For example, there are instances where, for certain types of negotiations, states are represented by extremely large delegations, simply because there are many agencies of the government that have an interest in the negotiations. But some of these may be agencies with fairly limited roles, and the question is whether, in those sort of circumstances, delegates from those agencies can participate remotely. And this has the advantage, of course, of doing away or reducing travel time that is incurred, absence from the office, but also I think to reduce the carbon footprint that such negotiations generate. I think these are some of the issues, the sort of advantages that might be gained from the deployment of a virtual meeting technology, even if the primary means of conducting these negotiations continues to be an in-person one. And these are things that we can reflect upon. I'll bring my statement to an end here, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel, for your insights. It is indeed very important, to see how all these international negotiating process, are put in place, and the human dimension still plays a very important role, to reach agreement or consensus among partner states. Now, Ayelet will just, Dr. Ayelet Berman will just tell us a bit more about international health regulations and how it has worked during the pandemic, and what may be needed in the future.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many participants interested in international law. So in the very short time that we generally have on this panel, what I'd like to do is really kind of give a short review of what has happened in terms of global health law as it pertains to the pandemic in the past year. So when we talk about pandemics from an international law perspective, we essentially have only one international treaty which deals with the prevention and management of pandemics, and that is the International Health Regulations. The International Health Regulations were adopted many years ago. They were last revised in 2005 by the WHO, and essentially they bind legally all of the member states of the WHO. So essentially most of the countries in the world are legally bound by the provisions of the International Health Regulations. Now, the goal of the International Health Regulations is, even though it's called regulations, as I said, it's a binding treaty, is to prevent and respond to pandemics or other public health emergencies that can spread internationally. So it could also be, for instance, chemical or biological events and so forth. But in any case, they apply to pandemics. And they set up certain legally binding obligations on the member states, and they also give the WHO certain powers to coordinate the entire response. Now, the main question really, which I think we need to ask ourselves, given that this is the main international legal framework that we have for dealing with pandemics, is how have the international health regulations fared? Have they been successful? And I think the answer across the board, and as we all feel, since we're all sitting at home essentially, is that there has been a major failure of these regulations. Of course, it's not only an international failure. We all know that many countries have failed as well. But overall, the international health regulations have not been successful in preventing this pandemic, nor in effectively managing its response. So there have most recently a report was issued by the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response. They really address many of the issues that went wrong with international health regulations. Of course, we also have a lot of expert commentary. What I'd like to just kind of give a sense of some of the main issues, which we already know. There's a lot that didn't go well under the international health regulations, but kind of the main issues, main obligations that exist and really didn't work out, let's say, as planned. So the first one is that essentially under the IHR, all member states are under the obligation to have public health core capacities in place. So they should be able to detect and prevent and notify whenever there is such an outbreak within their country that could become public health concern of international concern. That, as we know, was not the case. So many countries were very much unprepared for this pandemic, despite this legal obligation to have these capacities in place. Another obligation which exists under the international health regulations is that if you're a country that has an outbreak taking place, you need to notify the WHO within 24 hours. Now, so much ink and discussions have already been spilled on the slow notification by China of this event. So this has obviously also not worked. Another element that we have under the international health regulations is that the Director General can then declare a public health emergency of international concern. And the consequences then, of course, that the WHO can issue recommendations. Again, here we know I don't really need to add on this because there's this, but essentially we know that there's quite a lot of criticism against the WHO that they've been extremely slow in declaring this public health emergency. As a side note, not that it really mattered, because even when they did, many countries didn't act. So as I said, the failure was systematic, not just at the international level. There are other issues. The WHO issued recommendation not to stop ban travel or to limit travel, and countries acted otherwise, even though in retrospect maybe that was a wise decision. But in any case, the main point really coming out of this is that the international health regulations, they did not stand. Why is that the case? Maybe we'll have time to talk about that when we have time more for discussions, but I'll just note that really one of the biggest problems with the WHO is that there's a major gap between what the public expects from it and perhaps what politicians are being put forward and its actual powers. So the WHO is a member state driven organization. The powers are only those that member states have given to it. And essentially it does not have any inspection powers, nor does it have enforcement powers. So really it can't oblige any of its members to comply with any of the obligations under the international health regulations. Another problem that the WHO has very limited funding. Maybe we'll be able to talk about that later. So there's a major gap between what appear to be the expectations and the actual powers of the WHO. And of course, this has contributed to this failure. And is one of the issues which will undoubtedly come up in reform discussions, which I hope we'll be able to talk about soon. But I think what's really important for me to point out that it's not only matters that exist within the international health regulations that didn't work well because they were either not properly designed or not well implemented. But now that we're going through this pandemic, it's quite clear that there are very critical matters that are not regulated under the international health regulations, nor any other international legal framework for that matter. And I want to touch on two such topics. So one very important topic is actually preventing the spillover of zoonotic diseases. So COVID-19, zoonotic diseases are diseases that spill over from animals to humans. And most, if not all, of the pandemics and epidemics in recent years are all zoonotic diseases. So not only COVID-19, but Zika, Ebola, the first SARS, these are all zoonotic diseases. The international health regulations, they kick in once the outbreak has already begun. So once the fire has already started, that's when the international health regulations kick in. But we need to be working at a much earlier stage. We need to be working at the prevention stage. We know where the hotspots of zoonotic diseases are in the world. We know that there are 800,000 viruses that could emerge as diseases. So we need to be focusing on that prevention stage. At this point of time, there is absolutely no international legal framework which addresses any of that. So that's one point. And the second point is, of course, the whole matter of fair and equitable access to vaccines. So as we know, what has happened, there is no international legal framework which deals with this, not in the IHR nor in any other framework. And what has essentially happened now is that it's really followed the law of the jungle, because rich and powerful countries have bought up most of the vaccines. Developing countries, low and middle income countries, did not have the resources. And so now we have this very big gap between the developed world that is getting vaccinated and the developing world that is not receiving vaccines. There is one international initiative, which the ambassador mentioned before, which is COVAX, which is indeed a partnership between the WHO, Gavi, CEPI, and other organizations, where essentially developed countries have been donating money. And so through COVAX, vaccines are being distributed to developing countries. But still, and it's already taking place. So this is a process which has already happened place, but still we have a major gap. So the goal of COVAX is to have developing countries, 20% of the population in developing countries vaccinated by the end of the year. We all know that's not a lot, and I'm not even sure that they will be able to reach that goal. So we have this major problem, that we need to think about for the future, because unfortunately, all of the experts are telling us this is not the last pandemic. So to sum up these points, I think what's quite clear is that the international health regulations have not held well the pandemic, and we need to think about amending them or better implementing them. And we have all these other issues which need to be addressed going forward. Which brings me to the last point, and that is really what are we going to do? What is already being done about this? So as I said, we already have inquiry panels. So we have different bodies working on discovering and identifying what went wrong, such as the independent panel on pandemic prevention and response, which issued its report. We have within the WHO, we have a review committee that is looking at the international health regulations, and we have other NGOs and bodies looking at these issues. So the question really is, where do we go from here in terms of international law? Some have called, for instance, some have called for just improving the implementation of the international health regulations. So they're saying, actually, we have everything in place. We don't really need to, the problem is implementation. So we need to start thinking about how do we better implement the international health regulations? How do we strengthen the WHO and that mission? In the recent G7 meetings, that is one of the things that came up. There have been calls to improve implementation under the international health regulations. And that's one debate that's happening. On the other hand, there are those that are saying the international health regulations are not enough, actually, and we need to have something more. So the European Union and other countries have recently proposed a pandemic treaty, which would address these issues, which I've talked about, as well as others, so to have kind of a comprehensive treaty for the future. This is really just the beginning. They've agreed on having a special session at the WHO in November to discuss this pandemic treaty. So in a way, we're really just at the beginning of these discussions, because I think for many countries, we're really just still at the stage of putting out the fire. And most of the capacity within governments also is going to putting out the fire. But I think there's no other way than moving towards reform. The major questions, of course, will be, again, I think there are many proposals out there as to what went wrong and what could be or should be changed. One of the main issues is really how much do we strengthen the WHO? How much powers do we give the WHO? Do we give it enforcement power? Do we give it inspection panel powers? Some commentators are calling for that. But in the end, any power you give the WHO, it's taking away power from governments, from states. So in the end, it will really very much depend, not so much on legal imagination, because I think we know what kind of architecture we would like to see, but very much on political readiness of countries to create a newer, updated system. And we'll have to watch the space, because on the one hand, of course, COVID has created such tragic consequences that some states might be willing to take deep reforms. But on the other hand, of course, we have the geopolitical situation, which is causing a lot of tension and might make it very difficult to reach reform. So I think we'll just have to wait and see what happens in the year or years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayelet. Yes, you touched upon many issues and challenges faced by the WHO at multiple levels. It is true that international organizations have to reinvent themselves every time there is a major crisis. And what is the situation at the WTO? We have with us Professor Gabrielle Marceau, and she will tell us a bit more how WTO coped with the pandemic and what are the challenges for the organization. Professor Marceau, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Fabrice. Thank you and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
So I'm delighted to be with you. And yes, I'll say a few words on the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the role of international trade in times of crisis, and how the crisis and the pandemic has had, I don't want to say positive consequences, but has stimulated changes and new roles and new responsibility for the WTO. So allow me now to try to share my screen with you. Do you see it well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I wanted to start, often people ask the question, the pandemic is really an issue for the WHO, and of course it is. But a lot of actions of governments since the pandemic relate to food. Governments putting restrictions on the food they produce, relating to masks, ventilators earlier, and today, for instance, vaccines. So there's a lot of actions by governments that take place, and these actions are usually, traditionally, under the GATT rules and the WTO, supposed to be notified to the WTO. So what happened in March 2020, when the pandemic was formally sort of recognized as being going on? An enormous amount of questions and notifications to the WTO. And early on, it's interesting, Singapore, Lionel didn't talk about it, but Singapore and New Zealand were amongst the very first who sent message and a declaration and statement encouraging coordination and calm in international trade relations. The slide that is in front of you on GATT touches on one issue that has been running for a year and a half, which is the fact that in the old GATT rules and still WTO, one of the basic principles is that governments at the border should not put import or export restrictions. So Article 11 says this, no prohibition or restrictions, whether made through quotas, license, or otherwise. So government should not put export restrictions. However, the paragraph 2A opens a door of exception that has been invoked often by governments, and that explains the difficulty, for instance, of India. India, who had committed to produce a lot of vaccines for COVAX, and India, who was stuck with an exploding pandemic at home, and then did maintain export restriction, which are formally legal, consistent. 11.2 says that the prohibition on export restriction does not apply if you put in place temporary restrictions to prevent, we talked about prevention, or relieve critical shortage of foodstuff or other essential product. So this provision was the basis of a lot of notifications. The one that is below, I still put, because you have the right to basically, under Article 20B, more generally ignore GATT obligations if you do it to protect the health of your people. So I want to insist on that, because if it's true that collaboration, which became a core function of the WTO, if it's true that collaboration is necessary to deal with the pandemic, it's also extremely difficult to judge countries that want to maintain some export restriction. And that's the logic of Article 11.2. It's possible, but for a short time, only for essential goods, and because there's critical shortage, which is the situation during the pandemic. So what is the role or new role or enhanced role of the WTO? The previous WTO DG, Azevedo, when he saw the pandemic, decided to use what the G20 had done after during the financial crisis in 2008, that is asking coordination from members in their notification and sending all this to the WTO, not necessarily in a formal notification manner. This was part of the flexibility. You could almost just call the WTO and say, I will put this restriction, or I will give this subsidy, or I have this label change. In Canada, for instance, the requirement of bilingual labels on essential goods was suspended, and English only was considered sufficient. So the DG said, let's use the forum, and he created a web page on COVID, where, as you can see, this is just a photo. Every day, the countries that took actions that could be relevant for others, because if you block, for instance, food, agriculture products from leaving your country because you have limited, everybody's sick, well, of course, it affects others. Others should know. So this page, we just see a part, was set up for goods, for services, and for intellectual property. Another thing that was new is what is put here. Never the WTO Secretariat was invited to put forward papers, analytical papers on substance or on procedure statistics, the way, for instance, IMF or World Bank or OECD does. So these are just the first ones. They're now 45, and there will be more. And this was quite appreciated by governments to have, especially developing countries, maybe information about what others do, but the impact of what others do. Information that would, of course, inform also on supply chain. So this takes me to the next slides, where I try to sum up a little bit, the WTO being sort of encouraged by the WTO members to take new responsibility, not only for notification that is classic, although facilitated notification, but also this important role, as mentioned by Ambassador Fabrice at the beginning, of discussion, governance, coordination, cooperation, which you can do only if you see what others do and if you discuss. And engagement sort of grew from this transparency and coordination exercise. And on the right-hand side, quickly, things that have already been said or noted, the fact that in order to act intelligently, governments needed to know more and more, but and I mentioned the analytical role. One thing of the Secretariat, one thing that is now growing, and it's going to be my next point, was the realization that to deal with the pandemic and contain it, not only do you need coordination and collaboration between governments, but you need to involve the private sector. And people talk and talk and talk about supply chain, but as you know, supply chains involve a good deal of commercial and private actions where a company would buy one thing and not the other one. And this involves, of course, competition, antitrust, and investment, the famous Singapore issues that are sort of looming around the pandemic, because in order to deal with that, we should have more transparency, coordination, also on investment and competition. But as you know, it's been sort of postponed. And this takes me to this enhancing role of the WTO that came from the pandemic, that came from the need to deal with supply chain, but it's quite unique. I mean, you're all expert in public international law, that is a government-to-government relationship. WTO is part of that, but then governments realize, and I'll say a word about it, that even if there was a TRIPS waiver, a request by some countries to set aside intellectual property, as it was said very clearly at the beginning, at least by the European, what we need is more vaccine production. And we need to, therefore, bring closer producers, manufacturers, in order to set up and invest in countries so that there's more vaccine produced. This is a document, the 230, that I like very much. Its title and its content is unique. It's encouraging the DG to hold consultation on with vaccine developers and manufacturers, and of course in coordination with the WHO. It took place here 6 weeks ago in this building, well, virtually, but it's quite unique. Who would have thought that sort of meeting would take place here? And then you have more detail, sort of unused and underutilized production elsewhere, etc. These are all actions very close to the private actors in the debate. And this document also encouraged the WTO DG to update the members about this production increase efforts and coordination. Also, in the context of the pandemic, other governments, again, Switzerland, this is said to be put forward by the so-called Ottawa group, of which Switzerland, I believe Singapore, but different groups, different countries involved. And funny enough, because for some years the WTO was a bit sleeping, then you had, and I didn't want to put it on the screen, this is a very long document, very clear proposal. For instance, export restriction, the one example I used, sort of commitments to eliminate unnecessary ones, and you have the same about service, technical regulation, tariff. You may know that a lot of developing countries and least developed countries still maintain very high import tariff at the border on vaccines. And it could look weird, but for some countries, it's a fundamental source of revenue, the tariff. They needed to pay for hospitals and schools. Nonetheless, it's a contradiction. Look also the effort made in this footnote to define essential medical goods, because a lot of people said it could lead to abuse if you can put restriction on almost anything. So a very, very interesting amount of intellectual sort of production by governments that want to deal with the problem. And so all I'll say is, maybe we can talk, there was a proposal to waive intellectual property that is resisted by others, but the recognition is that you cannot deal with the pandemic just with a waiver, assuming it's good. And I'll say thank you. And the last proposal is a Canada proposal 2 years ago about using better and more the analytical role of the Secretariat, in particular in deliberative functions of the WTO. Thank you, and sorry for being too long.
Thank you, Professor Marceau. It was very, very insightful and detailed. I don't know if we have time to take one or two questions, because the participants have been very active. I think we would need a webinar as such to answer all questions that were put on the chat. But do we have one or 2 minutes to take
Yes,
one or two questions?
for sure.
Okay. So one question deals with the international health regulation and the prevention. To which extent do states have the political will to come together, you know, and address the issue of prevention and make it more legally binding? Ayelet, maybe that's for you. We don't hear you.
Yes, sorry about that. I think exactly that's the space to watch, because it's really too early to say will there be political will. There is certainly political will in some countries, but not necessarily in others. So the question will be, will they be able to reach an agreement? I don't think we know yet at this stage, because in the end, having any kind of prevention system will involve some kind of giving up of sovereignty, because the proposals that are currently in place talk about having like a global alert system, and which would give more power for investigative power to international bodies. So in the end, I mean, that's going to be the main question. How much powers will countries be willing to give up to other international bodies or to other member states? And it's really too early to say, actually, at this stage. We'll have to watch what happens.
And there is another very interesting question you may just take immediately, is like, what do we mean by fair and equitable distribution? How should we understand it? Are there any standards to measure it?
I don't think there's a formal definition. I think the idea was that, you know, in under the laws of the jungle, it was essentially the powerful and the rich got the vaccines. And, you know, there was a lot of unhappiness about, for instance, younger people in developed countries getting vaccines rather than those in need. So I think that idea behind fair and equitable access is to make sure that countries receive it based on need rather than based on power.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And there is a more legal question.
Ambassador, if you don't mind, just
yes,
also
please.
Supplement that. In some ways, I think it sort of is borne out by practice itself, because I think the COVAX facility did announce a distribution plan for especially, I think, for the developing countries in terms of how they were going to allocate vaccines, and it was, I think, was largely it was allocated sort of proportionately to the kind of populations that would need those vaccines. And from the literature, I don't get the sense that this was particularly controversial. I mean, the problem is actually the fulfillment of that distribution plan rather than the way that they had provisionally allocated the vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. I will stay with you because some participant in Japan asked us. We see some submissions to domestic court, especially on criminal law, but we see very few at the International Criminal Court invoking, for example, crimes against humanity for the management of COVID. What are your thoughts on the question? Please, Lionel, 30 seconds.
Just very, very briefly, I'm not sure I can see a very sort of clear link between actions that have been taken in the pandemic so far and things like crimes against humanity that fall within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. I think we are talking about things of quite a different order with respect to the crimes before the court. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So it was a very inspiring debate. Thank you to all the panelists, Lionel, Ayelet, and Gabrielle. I wish you all a very good afternoon. And now we can go on with the next block of the day. Thank you all.